Good morning and welcome to day 2 of WHC Connect. For those of you who don't know me, I am Margaret O'Gorman. I'm the president of the Wildlife Habitat Council. I hope you found yesterday's panels to be interesting and educational. I certainly did. And for those of you who are regular attendees at WHC conference, I can tell that you're all feeling absolutely fabulous today, having not had the distraction of the restaurants and bars of Baltimore last night. So it's great to see you all back. We have a great day planned today. First, we're going to hear from renowned expert on leadership, Dr. Kim Leary. Later this morning, we're going to have a great panel discussion on building back, or as Bill Cobb said yesterday, building forward with nature. This afternoon, we will address nature-based strategies for employee engagement and STEM education. So take a look at the schedule and join us for the sessions. Now, our upcoming session that's just about to start with Dr. Kim Leary is designed to be a conversation. So we will be moving from formal presentation to conversation throughout the time of the presentation. And we welcome your questions and we'll answer and include them in the conversation as we go. So please type them in to the Q&A panel. So right now, I have the pleasure in introducing Dr. Kim Leary. Dr. Kim Leary is a Senior Vice President of the Urban Institute and an Associate Professor at Harvard University, with posts at both the Chan School of Public Health and Harvard Medical School, as well as a cross-posting at the Harvard Kennedy School. Before Harvard, she served as Chief Psychologist of the Cambridge Health Alliance and was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Fellow and advisor to the White House Council on Women and Girls during the Obama administration. Kim is going to talk about leadership in a time of crisis. And this is not just about leadership at the so-called top. This is how we all exhibit leadership, whatever our position in the power structure. And for me, knowing your efforts on the ground, at operations, in the regions, and all the way up to corporate, I know many of you are all leaders for nature. So I'd like you to please welcome Dr. Kim Leary.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be with you virtually, and I look forward to conversations with the membership and guests of the Wildlife Habitat Council. Margaret, thank you for that introduction. As you can hear, I wear many different hats and move back and forth from being a clinician to being a professor and now to working with very talented colleagues at the Urban Institute across the 12 policy centers that we have. But what I want to do first is kind of remind us of where we've been over this last while. Perhaps you can't help but be reminded of that, but it can be helpful to take a step back. And that's what I propose to do for the first part of our conversation today. So if you're like me, March seems like 100 or 200 years ago. And I imagine that like all of you, you've experienced the same changes to many, if not all, dimensions of your professional life. So for me early on, last March, I had to transfer my experiential leadership class, where we were studying authority and power and voice and strategy, from a residential classroom to a Zoom classroom with about 3 days notice. And later on in the summer, I started a new senior leadership position at the Urban Institute, entirely remotely. In fact, I work from my guest room at home in Cambridge. And I have yet to meet most of my new colleagues in, as my students put it, real life. At the same time, as we've had to weather stresses, which I'll go on to say a little more about later on, in each of our domains and in the leadership that you've been exercising, there has been, at the same time as massive loss, massive innovation. So in my home discipline of healthcare, what we've seen is a rapid move in about 2 weeks' time from in-person delivery of healthcare to the use of virtual online platforms. And more was accomplished in those 2 weeks than in the preceding 2 to 3 years. Health leaders and practitioners had to make quick pivots. They had to develop new capacities in real time, and they had to make their peace with whatever had previously been viewed as an obstacle. Now, if we go back in time to March, again, at that time, despite our collective anxiety and stress, the pandemic also looked like it might potentially unite us. The lockdown and shelter-in-place orders asked us to make individual and family sacrifices for the good of our community, for the good of our neighbors. And in the early days of the pandemic, for example, as my students were repatriated to their homes across the globe, my role as a professor shifted. As I mentioned, I was teaching a course on authority and power and strategy. But as you might imagine, my course became a platform to meditate on leadership under crisis. And a lot of our attention was focused on the good and bad examples of leadership as people were trying very hard, people in leadership roles, to hold their communities through uncertainty. My students were also honest about their own fears, their own sense of grief, and the acute mourning that many were engaged in. I teach in a graduate school, so many of my students had come to Harvard for one precious year, and a third of that year was about to be taken from them. In sessions with public leaders, and I teach in the Bloomberg Harvard Leadership City Leadership Initiative. So in sessions with mayors and with senior city officials, we responded to mayors' questions about community mental health and helped them to understand and address stress from the bully pulpit that each was privileged to have. This meant trying to help mayors and city officials to appreciate that the very protective tactics that they were enforcing, the stay-at-home orders, for example, simultaneously brought new pressures to their communities, as parents who were able to work from home had also to juggle caregiving and then, beginning this fall, school again as well. We tried to help them to appreciate that certain populations would bear disproportionate burden, especially those with mental health and disability issues, and also older people in their community and frontline workers, which included not just healthcare professionals, but people driving the bus, stocking the grocery stores, and so forth. And we counseled them about how to become grievers in chief and to say the unimaginable, to console people who'd lost family members, but also explain to them that they couldn't hold a funeral or religious observances or rituals that people usually use to steady themselves at times of extremity. Now, back then, in March, the challenges were different at the start of the pandemic than they are now, some 7 months in, and with no end really in sight. And let me zoom out a little bit more to give us that picture. Before COVID-19, millions of people were living on the margins, only a paycheck or two away from missing their rent or not being able to buy groceries. And as a public health crisis took hold with a respiratory-borne virus, it generated an economic crisis, as stay-at-home orders meant that people had to, if they couldn't work from home, give up jobs or greatly truncate their working lives and hence their paychecks. And an already fraying social safety net meant that millions of people had no safe landing when they did lose jobs. And then, compounding that, longstanding health and economic disparities in communities of color were exacerbated by COVID-19. You know that Black and Latino communities have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, in part because of years of systemic racism and inequitable access to healthcare and other resources. And then, Black people, already traumatized by centuries of violence and brutality, hit a breaking point perhaps when George Floyd was killed on camera. And millions of allies across the country joined in to rise up in protest. And of course, all of these dynamics continue to play out while our democratic process and norms are being tested like never before. George Floyd's murder was just one of many instances of punitive policing, hundreds that have existed in this country. But it became an inflection point. And as a result of that, many more Americans became willing to see themselves in a different light. More of our neighbors and more of our friends came to recognize how deeply embedded structural racism is in our public and private systems. And as Americans began to take in the way stress is disproportionately present in some communities, even as they were acutely aware of the stress that they were feeling in their own homes and in their own communities, structural racism and anti-Black racism in particular moved from a thing that some could always see to something that now all could see. It became a kind of collective problem, a problem in my community, my problem, not just their problem. And my personal take on this, and it is without data, so it's just amusing, is that Americans are moved to action by the particular on behalf of specific injustices, especially those that they can see. And I think it's not incidental that George Floyd's murder occurred on camera. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we watched a man slowly suffocate to death. Possibly his death by suffocation affected us in a particular way at this moment, when we're all attuned to the horrors of the loss of breath as we understand how COVID attacks the body. Possibly we all felt vulnerable. Possibly that vulnerability enabled us to see ourselves in our neighbors. But I think it's also important to recognize that no change like this happens by accident. Activists and community groups have long been attuned to issues of structural racism, and they track statistics, they aggregate the biographies and stories of those who've been lost or injured by systemic racism. They track outcomes. But what happened over these last several months is that an issue became ripe, and that ripeness set the stage for change. And since then, hundreds of US firms and universities, nonprofits have made public statements that they would become anti-racist and address structural racism within their organizations. And they pledge considerable capital to accomplish those goals, ranging from DEI efforts in an organization to more fundamental overhauling of supplier lines and even governance. Just as some examples, in July, the Bank of America announced it would put $1 billion to racial equity initiatives. And just a few weeks ago, Citi launched more than $1 billion of initiatives to help close the racial wealth gap. Now, the most cynical among us might greet the banking and financial services' sudden commitment to racial equity with some skepticism, especially given their history of redlining and predatory lending practices, especially within communities of color. But even the most hopeful among us would also acknowledge that while resources are critical, money still has to be used wisely and well to drive authentic culture change. But wherever one falls on that spectrum, what is clear is that something important happened at a national level as a set of partisan and grassroots activists successfully ripened an issue and amplified it to become a matter of what my colleague Bob Blenton calls kitchen table policy. Not the policy you read about in reports or on websites, but the policy you talk about across your breakfast table and your evening dinner table. And perhaps no greater indication of success about this ripening is the fact that it instigated some critical blowback. You may have followed the story of Princeton University, which, like many universities, admitted to and apologized for its past history of racism. The current administration, the current president, moved then to sue Princeton for violating federal civil rights law, given that they had now essentially said that they had been subject to racism. And the current president executive order combating what is referred to as sex and race stereotyping in trainings within executive agencies and by federal contractors is a fairly blatant effort, I would have to say, to make it very costly for those federal agencies and contractors to continue to grapple open and honestly with structural racism. So you see the movement forward and you see the response to it. So this means that we can, as we sort of listen to the story, I hope you'll see that COVID-19 has become an example of what C.W. Churchman called a wicked problem, a problem whose social complexity means that it has no discernible stopping point, and where forces affect and accelerate one another, just as we see in the natural world, just as you all see in the natural world with climate change and biodiversity disruption. Now, another important dimension of wicked problems is that they tend to leave communities disoriented. It's difficult to lead people, as you've no doubt found, when they are scared, disoriented, and just bracing for the next wave of change. And to be relevant in the face of crisis, and that's, by the way, the most important challenge leaders face in crisis, is to be relevant to the people they're trying to lead, to be speaking to the concerns that are on their minds and in their hearts. So to be relevant, people who are in leadership and authority roles need to help people cultivate a sense of situational awareness. Where are they now? The pandemic is different now, 7 months in, than it was in March. Are your policies and messaging about the present moment, not the prior one? Leaders also have to pivot to a process of agile problem solving and recognize that solutions can come up and down the organizational chain. And so partnership needs to be something that isn't just across elites, but it's something that's up and down across your organization. And an important part of this pandemic, as we've seen, is that leaders have to prepare people for difficult choices on competing priorities. And to do so, they have to communicate, and they have to communicate accurately, honestly, empathically, and ideally in ways that promote effective action. As we move into the we move away from the formal presentation, I want to just say make two more points about the tools that people in leadership and authority roles have at their disposal. One you're probably most familiar with from the titles and job descriptions and warrants that you have being a director or a chief or a CEO. One of those is the power to compel. The Yale political scientist, Robert Dahl, talks about the power to compel in this way. A has power over B to the extent that he or she can get B to do something they would not otherwise do. And those resources, being able to set an agenda, call a meeting and know people will come to it, et cetera, allow leaders to move and compel others, including past the point of their own resistance. And while you can do that, what you'll find typically is that people will follow you to the letter that they have to. The other tool, and in some ways maybe the more important tool, particularly if it's integrated with the tools that allow you to compel, are the tools that allow you to inspire. And here, I'll mention a name that you may never have heard of before, Mary Parker Follett, who is a very important organizational behavior theorist from the early 20th century and a mother in many ways of modern organizational practice. She said that equally important is the ability of leadership to unleash the energy of the group, to help groups reach their desired and purposeful ends. And to do that, we have to have the skills to draw out from our colleagues their fullest potentials, the ability to integrate voices and multiple voices so that they cohere and become a song, if you will, and to surface new values, particularly in times like we are right now of critical change. So why don't we pause right there? And Margaret, I know you wanted to have a little conversation at this point.
Sure, yes. Thank you so much. You packed so much into that segment. I'm really, we can go in so many different directions, but what I think I'd like to kind of go back to the beginning, and you talked about how you were helping mayors to appreciate how the tactics that they were implementing had different impacts, and impacts of stresses on different ways. And it kind of brought me to mind of something that has driven me crazy during this pandemic, is people saying we're all in this together. While everybody is, yes, impacted, people are impacted in completely different ways. So I find the statement "we're all in this together" to be somewhat wishful thinking in a way, in terms of the impacts on people. And so that's just, if you could kind of talk a little bit about more about that, how there's been a disparate impact on individual and communities' ability to react to the pandemic.
Sure. Very important observation, Margaret. It's both and, isn't it? There are very few areas of our lives these days that have not been affected by the pandemic. In the most general, abstract way, we are in it together. But if you stop there, you won't really be able to be effective in most leadership and authority roles, because we know that the pandemic is differentially affecting constituencies and people, regions of the country, and that there's so much fluidity that the state of play in April is now different than the state of play in October. So in speaking with mayors and city officials, what we tried to do was, first of all, help them, as they are now prone to do anyway, they didn't need our help on this score, to make use of the data that they had at their disposal, to know which areas of their communities were being affected and in what ways by the pandemic. Were evictions higher in certain areas? Were some schools able to open, private schools, for example, and not public schools, and so on? Which hospitals and clinics were on surge capacity at the worst of the pandemic? And that data gives you a picture of different constituencies who are differentially experiencing the pandemic. But from the bully pulpit, we can't just address any one of those communities or any two of those communities. We have to figure out how those communities can integrate their efforts in order for the whole to prosper. That's the art of leading collective challenges, of being able to pivot to speak to a very granular and perhaps niche community, and then move to a larger community and be able to translate back and forth what you're hearing as you are listening in. And you can't just do that within your own organization. You have to have an eye and an ear outside to the ecosystem in which you're operating. Does that begin to address what the question you were raising?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. And the other thing that you said that I thought was very interesting in terms of, I think a lot of our members, you said initially that the systems that you worked with, the medical systems and other things, that they had to make peace with what had usually been viewed as an obstacle. And we saw that with a lot of the companies that we work with, where they had to basically take action that allowed things to happen that would never normally have happened, like having a dispersed customer service workforce working from their own homes instead of in call centers. And a variety of other things that the corporate world overall had maybe been challenged with for many years, in thinking about how they looked at their workforce, they looked at their communities, they looked at their operations, and having to make peace with that. I just thought it was a very interesting observation. And from your community, like, what were the things that you saw were the big changes in terms of having to make peace with previous obstacles?
Sure. One of the important dimensions of crisis is that crisis does concentrate attention, and it can concentrate resources, because the threat requires immediate adaptation. So in a healthcare setting, hospitals were open, but most units at the height of the pandemic had transformed an orthopedic area into a COVID recovery area, or a child therapy clinic was now a place for people to recover from COVID. You know, those are just, you know, sort of generic examples. But I think what, you know, the healthcare system, of course, is much broader than our hospitals and our emergency rooms. It includes a lot of elective procedures. It includes office visits. It includes wellness checks and so forth. And the choice that we faced at a time of a pandemic was either, broadly speaking, we close up shop and say, we'll offer healthcare again when the pandemic is over, which was not a tenable proposition, or we will have to get very creative and we'll have to figure out how to use the existing tools we have at our disposal. And telehealth has been in effect for some time, but it's been relatively niche. And in order for it to be something that could be offered, you had to have governors and state legislatures enact immediate relief from some of our regulations, where telemental health or telehealth is reimbursed at a different rate than in-person care. That's setting up a disincentive for doing this work. So you had to have the clinicians who had to get comfortable with Zoom and learn how to adapt their tools to virtual visits. But you also had to have an environment in which that was possible. And that meant being able to get the right conditions to make that healthcare possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, that is an interesting changes that we saw there. And as I said, in the companies that we work with, some very similar just shifts. And I think one of the most interesting ones was many of the companies that we worked with very quickly pivoted to creating, you know, hand sanitizer and things like that, whether it was an automotive manufacturer like GM and Toyota, or Bacardi talked about it yesterday, that they had pivoted to new manufacturing systems and manufacturing new products that they were not tooled up for, but they retooled quite quickly, which was interesting.
It is interesting. I mean, and in order to do that, you have to know what your core capacities are, right? Mm-hmm. Are your factories poised, and do you have supply chains that would allow you to make hand sanitizer? Or is that just something that you might like to do but can't do? So it requires understanding of core capacities, the workforce you have, and an understanding of what the ecosystem requires. I wanted to say one more thing about the pivot to at-home work, because it's also important, and you alluded to this earlier as well. You know, it's true that we can be tracked through our computers. I think there's even a little device here on this platform that tells us who's paying attention and who's not in the aggregate. I don't know the specifics. I forget what it's called here, but I think it's called the attentiveness factor. So even though the technology can track us, some of that, you know, has been turned off, some of it has been kept on. But ultimately, trust is required. Trust is required between leadership and workforce. And that trust has come to mean that leaders have to understand what flexibilities are necessary when your 3-year-old coworker needs to have a nap, and people need to understand that maybe work is best spread out over 7 days rather than 5 days. And that requires a recrafting of a kind of compact between leadership and workforce, either formally or informally. And so the renegotiation of trust has also been, I would say, an important part of the kind of innovation that we've seen.
That's a really good, we've talked about that. I mean, Wildlife Habitat Council is very small, but we also work with these very large companies, and that renegotiation of trust is a very interesting, an interesting concept that I haven't heard it in those words before. But I think for us, and I think comparing ourselves to other maybe NGOs specifically, is there had to be that level of trust to renegotiate that trust in the first place. which I
Yes.
think is very interesting. You know, those who have been successful in that pivot have had a level of trust, I think, that we're able to renegotiate with. And I think for us, with our membership and supporting our membership, we talked a bit about this yesterday, pivoting to that, I think we're kind of this big family of conservation passionate people who are really trying to do the right thing in very strange and landscapes, sometimes very strange operational needs. But we pivoted to supporting them in a different way. And I think because we have a great trust between us, that allowed us to do that.
Yes. And that trust is one that, you know, there's a paradox of trust, right? In order for there to be trust, in some sense, you have to begin to act in trustworthy ways. It's kind of like the idea of safe spaces. Usually you can't declare a space as safe, and that becomes an achievement of what people are willing to do with one another. So there is a paradoxical dimension of this. Another aspect of what you're saying is that when the crisis is at hand, that's not the moment to begin developing trust. Yeah. Trust needs to be a continuous concern. And just like knowing what your core capacities are, that needs to be something that leadership continuously keeps an eye on in order to be ready for the unpredictable.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have one comment basically says, do not suggest we work 7 days. That will quickly turn into 8 to 10 hours of work 7 days a week. So
no. Yes, I'm not suggesting that 7 days is a solution from on top. What I am saying is that if you listen to, and this goes back to your earlier point, if you listen to different constituencies, they will come up with different solutions. And some in organizations I've worked with have said, it would be better if we worked fewer hours a day, but it was spread over a longer period of time. Others have said, just as you did, oh, no, that will simply mean we will never have a chance to recoup and we'll work longer hours. And in fact, that's what's happening with the pandemic. So this is a perfect example of what we'll go on to talk about in this next section, is what happens when you have different ideas about how to solve a problem. What do you do under those circumstances? And I think that might be a nice segue to the next section.
Absolutely.
Okay?
I'll turn my camera off and you carry on. Thank you.
Okay. So what I'd like to do now is maybe give you a framework that's been in the background of my remarks thus far. It's a framework that my colleagues and I from the Kennedy School use quite frequently in trying to help people in leadership and authority roles. And I'll say more about why I keep saying leadership and authority and what I mean by that, to help them to think about the kind of problems they're facing and how to use the tools they have at their disposal. So organizational problems, according to this model called the adaptive leadership model, can be broadly differentiated into two types. Of course, there are hundreds of types, but broadly into two types for the purposes of trying to put some ideas in play for us. One type of problem are technical problems, and the other type are versions of the wicked problem model that I mentioned before, which we can also think of as adaptive problems. So technical problems and adaptive problems. And resources that drive change can also fall into two types. You had a little glimmer of that when I was talking about Robert Dahl and Mary Parker Follett. They're resources that can drive change through authority, power and resources. And they're also tools where you can drive change through leadership. And leadership here has a very particular meaning that I want to underscore. It's not the title you carry. It's not the resources per se or the power at your disposal, although those are certainly important. It's the ability to mobilize people. And in the face of a collective problem, in the face of people looking at a problem and seeing different things, and so seeing different solutions, the relevant capacity is mobilizing people in your organization, in your community, to begin to learn together. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So let's try the first slide. I have a few slides here that I thought I would put up just because I thought they might be a little bit of a way to break up the talk. Could I get the first slide, please? Yeah. So this, what I want to talk about now are this class of problems that I've called technical problems. And a technical problem is one where the challenge is known and relevant expertise exists. You may not have it immediately at hand, but it exists somewhere on the planet. And there are established rules of the game. And if you follow those rules of the game, you're likely to make progress on a technical problem. Now, it might take a long time. It's not an overnight thing or even a several month thing, but following those established rules of the road and aggregating expertise will allow you to make progress. And the coronavirus, the virus that causes COVID-19, is an example of a technical problem. If we think about just the coronavirus, not COVID-19, but the virus itself. So over the last decades, medical scientists and bench researchers have learned quite a lot about viruses. And currently, we're applying that knowledge, we broadly speaking, across the globe, to develop vaccines and therapeutics. And we have established tools and routines, one of those being clinical trials. But to make progress on developing a vaccine, the resources you need to bring to this technical problem are the resources of authority. And people in authority, let's think Tony Fauci for the moment, are given authority, that is, they have resources and power, including the power of the bully pulpit, in exchange for a set of services. And people in authority are always expected to provide services to their community. And the most common services that authority figures are asked to provide is some kind of protection for people doing the research on vaccines to be able to do their work, some kind of direction, go here, follow this line, not that one, and to provide some kind of order. We're going to use clinical trials, even though we're in emergency conditions. And what authority allows you to do, what those resources and power enable you to do, and I'm sure you already know this in your own roles in your organizations, is that authorities can aggregate expertise. You can call people to a meeting. You can call people from one part of the company and another part of the company to come together and say, we need to solve this with both of your operational units. And authorities can also enable collaboration. They can incentivize collaboration. And by virtue of being engaged with those expert people who have authoritative expertise, they can help focus coordination. So this is an example of a technical problem. And technical problems are ones that we face a lot. And if you use the tools of authority well, you can make progress on a technical problem, generally speaking. But let's bring our conversation a bit closer to home. And if I could get the next slide, please. Okay, so according to my colleagues at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, while we don't have direct evidence that climate change is influencing the spread of COVID-19, we do know, and you know quite well, that climate impacts alter how we relate to other species on our planet and on matters that relate to our health and either increase or decrease our risk for infections. And many of the root causes of climate change seem to increase the risk of pandemics. Deforestation, for example, which occurs, as I understand it, mainly for agricultural purposes, is still the largest cause of habitat loss worldwide. So what we might think of here is that climate and conservation also are species of adaptive challenges or wicked problems. And let me give you now a slightly more refined definition of an adaptive challenge. They're big problems that are difficult, some would say impossible to solve quickly, because the conditions are in flux. And because the people who are living that problem, living with that problem, impacted by that problem, have a variety of values that do not neatly align with one another. And the other marker of an adaptive challenge is that our legacy problem-solving strategies no longer work. So let's go to this hallmark of an adaptive challenge as one where the problem looks different to different people. You know, if you look at this slide here, how do you affect COVID-19? Well, depending on your perspective, you might want to look at climate change, and that might be where you put your attention, or perhaps the recession, or perhaps structural racism, as we discussed before. But people are in conversations about what to do, and they have different ideas about the problem, and so they wind up having different ideas about what the solution should look like. And this means that adaptive challenges are fundamentally problems of communities. That is, communities of people who are working on issues. The problem, in some sense, belongs to the community that has it, and expertise alone will not yield a solution. And here's where our special definition of leadership comes in. To solve an adaptive challenge, leadership is needed. And leadership means mobilizing people on behalf of that collective problem. And digging deeper into that, mobilizing people means helping them to understand perspectives other than their own, and helping them to recognize that we are both all in it together, going back to Margaret's point earlier, even as we have very distinctive ideas and very distinctive experiences about what it is that we're in and how it's differentially affecting our community, our family, etc. But people have to, if it's in a collective problem, if they are party to it in some way, then they mobilizing people on behalf of collective problem solving also means preparing people for the possibility of loss if the group is to make progress as a whole. You can't have 15 ideas about a solution. Maybe you have 2. And that means you're going to have to work with your community, work with your group, work with your team for some of those ideas to move forward and others to be put in the background. So when people come together with differing values on a shared problem, the art of leadership, and I'm sure you've experienced this, the art of leadership is learning how to disappoint people at a rate they can stand. So why don't we stop there for another bit of conversation, Margaret?
Sure, yes, thank you. I love that definition of the art of leadership, disappointing people at a rate they can stand. I think it's a really true definition. And I also, when you were talking about, you know, a big problem that is hard to solve because the conditions are in flux and there are non-aligned values. I mean, that is the biodiversity crisis wrapped up in great words. It's exactly how difficult the biodiversity crisis is to solve, to communicate, to kind of even get our arms around, because it affects different communities in different ways. The solutions are different. Our values are not all the same around nature. So what I'm interested in is, you know, learning a bit more about how adaptive leadership can advance that, because there has been, you know, over the years, various different approaches to solving the biodiversity crisis, and they've usually come from one community. And it's a very a kind of white Western community of conservation practitioners, usually very male community as well, who've advanced the science in many, many ways, but have really viewed one solution to the problem, which is kind of looking at biodiversity hotspots and setting land aside without thinking about the community aspect of that. So does that kind of sound very similar to some of the problems you've been exploring, those wicked problems?
Absolutely. You know, I think one of the pleasures, for example, with my new role at the Urban Institute is that because I have the opportunity to look across our different policy centers, we see where issues like biodiversity show up in more than one place, right? Where it's not just in one center, but the issues come up in a variety of contexts, from environmental justice to even housing and healthcare or illness. And, you know, I think that many of our methods are technical ones, right? They're the ones that we use for, RCTs, being able to do randomized control trials. Very important set of tools. But increasingly, I think we recognize that hearing from communities, and Urban has a very active community engaged methods group, hearing from communities and having tools to make sure that the voices of lived experience are put in conversation with our technical problem solving, I think speaks to the issues that you've just identified. And you have to know, though, who's not in the conversation, and you have to know who has a point of view or perspective that might be relevant in order to bring those voices together.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think we've seen increasingly, we've been working with the corporate sector for 3 decades, and I think increasingly we've seen a lot more appreciation of bringing in the community voices, especially in some of the programs that we have in the most challenging urban areas where traditionally operations have been located. So we've seen companies, you know, like DTE, Fiat Chrysler and others really listening to the communities as they have been advancing out and implementing nature-based solutions, which is, you know, has had an impact not just on the nature, but also the relationship with the communities that are abutting these operations, rather than the community at large, but the immediately impacted one. And we've seen some really great evolutions in conversations happening around that. So how we institutionalize that, so everybody does it, because there are some industry sectors I feel that are less comfortable doing it because of a history, their histories, their cultures. So how do we actually help model that behavior and echo or amplify that behavior to show that that is kind of how good adaptive leadership works?
Yeah. So I think that's a really important question of, like, it's great to know that there are technical problems and adaptive challenges, but how does one begin to work with those? And I'll say a little bit more about that as we go on. But right now I'm reflecting on a class I taught last year before the pandemic, where we used design thinking as part of the classroom strategy. And the students were in what we call an innovation field lab type experience, where they were given a problem and some information and a client, and they were asked to come up with a solution that would be non-trivial and also not already on the client's list of what to do. So one of my student groups was working with a conservation organization, and this organization wanted to do 2 things. They wanted to diversify, and by that they meant both ethnic and racial diversity, but also age diversity. They wanted to bring in younger people, and they realized that they had to change their methods, and they had ideas about podcasts and video webinars and so forth. That didn't seem to be doing it yet. So my students went through this design process, and they came up with an idea of what if we treated the plants and trees and flowers and gardens as urban forest? And what if they started to think about how could they invite stewardship in a community around the city trees, the city gardens, flower pots on people's steps and so forth. Now, that's not going to solve the conservation problem that this organization had, but it did immediately kind of open up many more people that you might think of. You might not have a defined interest in conservation per se, but you might be interested in your vegetable garden. You might be interested in the shade the trees provide. And the group found that interesting to consider, and it offered them a relatively novel idea, but it especially attached to the problem they were trying to solve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that idea. It's framing it in a different way. I think the profession of conservation views very large systems, very large landscapes, but doesn't really think about the human and the personal connection they have. Earlier this year, we held a strategic planning exercise with a company down in Houston, and one of the icebreakers was that we asked participants to tell us about a personal experience with nature. And of the participants, those who had a rural background talked about nature as a system, talked about an ecosystem, a wetland or forest. Those of an urban background talked about a specific species or a specific tree or a specific bird that visited their window when they were feeling ill. And it was such an interesting kind of dichotomy of approaches to what nature is that shows that there are so many different ways to think about nature overall and then think about the solutions.
And that's a perfect example then of if you're treating the challenge of conservation as one that has multiple constituencies, how do you begin to include devices and vehicles for people to engage in crosstalk from those who see the system, are exposed to the system, and those who have a much more granular and personal relationship with a bird, a tree, the trees on their block. Maybe there are opportunities for engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what's really cool about our community of practice at Wildlife Habitat Council is we are dealing at a very granular level where a single tree has value to our wildlife teams in some areas, whereas in others, they're looking at very large reclamation projects over tens of thousands of hectares and everything in between. And I think that's a beautiful story that we can tell as Wildlife Habitat Council is going from the large system right down to the single tree.
Right. Let's go on to the third part of this, if that's okay, Margaret, and then we'll have time for some additional questions. Okay, great.
Thank you.
So, Margaret asked this really important question, which is, frameworks are great. They come from wonderful academic traditions, but how do we actually use this? How do you use this? How might you use this in your work going forward? So let me first share one of the most common mistakes that people in leadership and authority roles make. And it's this: they treat what is fundamentally an adaptive challenge or a wicked problem as though it were a technical problem. And they bring together expertise and they decide on metrics and they convene a task force, and lo and behold, at the end of that process, there's been some progress, but not the progress they hoped for. So this common diagnostic mistake can have a significant impact on our ability to generate progress for adaptive challenges if we don't recognize that a different set of methods are needed, a different way of engagement, a different way of thinking, a different kind of porousness about who's in the room. So if I could get the next slide, please. Yeah, so this gives you a sense of, kind of what it looks like when we graph out adaptive challenges and technical problems. But I want to draw your attention to the middle row. And if you could just click the slide again, please. Yeah, the middle row here. This is important because most of the time, if you think about it, the problems that come to you in your leadership and authority roles, the problems that come in your inbox, don't come with a subject heading that says, this is a technical problem. Make sure you use the full complement of your authority, aggregate expertise, and orient people and provide them with protection. You don't have an email that comes in with the subject line that says, this is an adaptive challenge. Make sure you engage people, as many constituencies as possible, and create a process of learning. So it's easy to make that kind of a mistake of, treating a technical problem as though it were an adaptive challenge and vice versa. The other challenge that you no doubt face in all the work that you do is that most significant problems, especially public problems, come bundled. They have adaptive elements and they have technical elements. COVID-19 is one of those. To deal with COVID-19, we do need therapeutics. we do need a vaccine. That will probably come from a more technical problem-solving process. But who receives the vaccine first? Who receives the vaccine second? And how do we not only build back better, but make sure that we build back more wisely becomes a matter of an adaptive challenge. And both of those are in play right now. So how can you begin to make progress on these adaptive challenges? What are some tools that you can use? I'm just going to mention a few here because our time is limited. And usually when we use this framework, when we teach it, either in an executive education format, we have, a couple of days. We have workshop sessions where people can kind of grapple with the adaptive challenges in their community. And they can begin to look at a problem and say, this is the technical part, this is the wicked part. But there's still a few that I can share with you here. So if I could get the next slide, please. So there are a couple of tools that we use that are tools of perspective, and maybe you've heard them in other contexts. But we talk about the metaphor of being on the balcony and the metaphor of being on the dance floor. Now, the metaphor of being on the dance floor is where we are much of the time in our leadership and authority roles. We're in the throes of action. We're directing people, we're coordinating them, and so forth. And when you're on the dance floor, if you think about times you've actually been dancing on a dance floor, you're very engaged, but you pretty much can only see who is immediately in your vicinity. Your perspective is limited to what's immediately in front of you, more or less. But when you go to the balcony, as you can see in this image, you have a very different perspective. In my field of psychology, we call it observing ego. And going to the balcony is a way of stepping back to see the larger context, to see who's hugging the wall and not even involved in the dance. Those go to the constituencies that perhaps could be engaged. And you may also see, especially if you go to the balcony, regularly, who's left the room altogether, who's become so disengaged that they're not even there, and special outreach will be needed. So this simple framework of being in the action, being on the dance floor, and cultivating a practice to go to the balcony is a really critical tool. And with respect to adaptive problems, you can't get to the balcony by yourself. It's not enough to step back and say, okay, what do I see? You actually need the perspectives of others to even know what you're missing or to give added meaning to what you do see. So bringing people together, having trusted advisors, having people that you regularly solicit their advice, and make sure that you empower them to tell you things you may not want to hear is an important practice. And then another practice, if I could get the next slide, this is going to be a little more interactive with all of you. It's a practice of radical empathy from your leadership and authority roles. If you have a pen handy, like an ordinary pen or a pencil, if you could grab it right now and find a piece of paper somewhere near you. And I'm going to give you a very simple task. I want you to scrawl your signature as quickly as you can. The way you do, several times a day when you're writing a check or, signing a letter if it's not email. As quickly as you can, scrawl your signature. So my guess is that this is something you've done all your lives, at least since you were about 5. And you're really comfortable with it. In fact, it's just something that's automatic. It flows easily. And that's the way most of us think we want to work with others in organizations. But try something. Take this pen and now switch it to your other hand. This will be your non-dominant hand for most of you. And now, scrawl your signature. What's the experience like now? Well, mainly, you probably feel awkward. It doesn't flow as quickly. And you may even feel de-skilled. Now, the reason I mention this is that if we think of this as change that you're trying to drive in your organization, you are asking people to take on work that leaves them feeling awkward, de-skilled, and without their usual points of orientation. And radical empathy of what you're asking people to do is absolutely critical when you're in leadership and authority roles. And I'll tell you why. If I were to ask you, and I won't now, to scrawl your signature again, most of you would pick up the pen in your dominant hand. You would go back to your default. And that's one reason why so many large-scale initiatives fail in firms. People default to what they know, because in order to keep learning, in order to acquire facility with the unknown, it takes radical empathy and radical attention. So if leadership means mobilizing others with respect to a collective problem, and if that collective problem means that each stakeholder has a different perspective on that problem, each stakeholder is writing a slightly different signature, and if those perspectives are different, you're not going to be able to solve them with an authoritative decree. You can't just say, write legibly, if that doesn't involve a skill set that someone has when using their non-dominant hand. They don't have the expertise. So more is required of those in leadership roles. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about what that looks like. If I could get the next slide, please. So the activities of leadership, and remember in this definition, leadership isn't the title that you have, it's the activities, the behaviors you engage in. And there are basically 5 that are critical, at least 5 that we highlight. One is the critical capacity to tell a story that helps people to understand where they are in a changing context and how to locate one another as they're trying to do unfamiliar work. That work needs to be recognized as belonging to the community. And if the community is doing that work, leadership, mobilizing people on behalf of that collective problem, means trying to help the community and different stakeholders figure out what they each need to learn, and to devise experiments that help them to learn more. This requires, as we talked about earlier this morning, the ability to trust, and to think of trust as a capacity that has to be developed. And one way to do that is what we call learning publicly. That is, in your leadership and authority role, learning in front of your people, letting them see how people grapple with the unknown, not just the finished product. And like the mayors and city officials that I mentioned earlier in the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative, some part of most adaptive challenges involves acknowledging the losses that people will have to bear if they're going to make progress. This means you also have to have a healthy stomach for helping people to maintain productive levels of disequilibrium. And, as I said earlier, to work on disappointing people at a rate they can stand, at a rate they can metabolize. And if all of that is working in concert, what you will find as part of an adaptive leadership approach is that you're generating more leadership within your organization. More people feel they have a voice from up, middle, and above in the org chart. But for that to happen, the people at the top in leadership and authority roles have to also be clear about the importance of protecting dissenting voices and not trying to squelch them, even if ultimately some dissenting voices may well not, be ones that you can listen to at this particular time on this particular issue. So those are the activities of leadership. Now, I imagine your experience during these last 7 months is that you have been working incredibly hard. And the work of leadership is very hard. And you will also need to make sure that you provide yourselves with sanctuary. And if I could get the next slide, please. Sanctuary is a really critical dimension of a leader's toolkit, of being able to find a way to replenish yourself. And there are many ways that people can do that personally. For some, it's a religious or spiritual practice, sports for others, playing with kids or grandkids, a musical instrument, the arts, lots of ways that people acquire sanctuary. But you're also going to need two other types of people in your lives. One group of people are what we call allies. These are people usually within your organization or your professional association who can help you on specific causes and for specific reasons. But they have loyalties beyond you. So sometimes they're going to have to say no when you want their help. The other group of people are the ones that we call confidants. These are people usually outside of your organization, maybe outside of your professional group, maybe on another side of the country. My brother's part of a veterinary practice where they work in working groups, but with people from different regions of the country so that they're not in conflict with one another. And their loyalty, confidants, is to you alone. And they can be a very good platform for problem solving and idea generation because they're interested only in you and not themselves. So cultivating allies and cultivating confidants can be really critical. And in closing, let me say that, you know, I've been privileged to have these teaching roles and then leadership and authority roles, and to be part of, in a delimited way, of the Obama administration, where we all had one boss. So we're looking at large-scale leadership. And I can say this, that stewarding people through change, my personal experience has been, and I imagine yours as well, is one of the most meaningful things that one can do with a human life. The important thing is to make sure that you don't become anesthetized to the challenges your people are facing. And the best way to do that is to also make sure that you put on your own seatbelt before assisting others. And thinking about your places of sanctuary is one way to do that. So thank you very much, and I'll stop there. We'll have a few minutes for questions, I think.
Great. Kim, thank you so much. That was great. And I can see for us at Wildlife Habitat Council, and I can see for many of our community of practice, thinking about the balcony and the dance floor, thinking about radical empathy. For our teams all over the world, whether they're in, you know, the wildlife teams, whether they're in Indonesia, Arizona, Detroit, Mexico, you know, a lot of them are leading in activities that are not core to the companies. So in that case, they have to stand on the balconies because they're not in the dance floor. And I think also because it's not mission centric for many of these companies, for the companies that we work with, just understanding where other people are and bringing them on board with an empathy approach, I think is really a great tools for both kind of those two tools are great, both ways to get people engaged in nature. And just, you know, as we're wrapping up, I did have a comment came in from Treva, one of our team members who works for Marathon in Detroit, and she said she's working on addressing racism in a school system, and she finds the framework of a wicked problem very useful. So hopefully Treva will also find the tools that you presented very useful. And another question that came in was about going back to trust and how trust happens. Trust is necessary under a pivot. And so Josiane asked, is similar to trust being a key piece of the solution in time of crisis, do you consider in this current crisis, nature will be elevated as another pillar of solution, particularly to address individuals' health and well-being?
Well, let me answer that first with what my doctor said in my first virtual visit with him a few months ago. He said, you know, the best advice that I'm giving people right now is get out in nature. Spend some time outside. Take a walk by the Charles River. Walk in one of the nature preserves, because we are all in artificial light much of the time, even if we have sunlight coming through our windows. We're breathing pre-circulated air whether it's through the heating system, depending on where you are in the country. It's getting cool here in Boston, or through air conditioning. And our feet are traversing tile or wood floors or linoleum, depending on where we're living. But being outside and being aware of a much longer time course, you can see in towering trees a much longer time course is what he recommended, literally, as a way of being able to deal with the stress that all of us are under. And I hadn't asked him about stress. I just asked him, what do you recommend, these days? And these were his words coming quite from the heart. And he said he offered this advice to everybody. So the answer is yes, I would say.
Okay. Well, I'm going to actually end us on that, because I think what I would like is for everybody on this meeting today to take the doctor's advice, take the Harvard professor's advice, and to understand how much nature is necessary as we continue in our in our situation, whether it's in something like forest bathing, which is an emerging profession of engagement with nature, or whether it's just walking around the block and seeing what's blooming or what's not blooming anymore. But Kim, thank you so much. I think your presentation was such a good context setter, but it was also provided us with tools and techniques and different ways of thinking about our challenges today. So thank you very, very much for this presentation. I really appreciate it. And I've already gotten some really positive feedback through our sessions here from people who are feeling strange not being able to applaud. So just think about the applause that's in your head right now. So thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure to chat with you in this way, and I hope maybe at some point in the future there'll be an opportunity to chat again. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you, Kim. And for everybody else, come back at 11:15. I'll be here again, and we're going to talk to executives from CEMEX and General Motors about the past, present, and future for biodiversity of those two companies. And in the same way you access this session, you'll need to exit the screen and go back to the Attendify platform. So I'll see you in half an hour. Thank you very much. And again, Kim, thank you.